So I just met Seth today, but I know he works for NetSPI, which is another great sponsor of us. So thanks again for doing this, Seth. I think we just told him like 2 minutes ago that he was going to be here, and he just rushed in and used a USB stick, and we'll see how that goes, right? Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right. Let's see if we get the title to pop up here. Well, wonderful. Thanks for the introduction. I'm really happy to be able to speak at this event. I think OWASP has done a ton of great things for application security in the community, and obviously one of the topics, or the topic I'm going to talk about today, has to do with the payment card industry and some of their standards, and we see references within this standard to OWASP, and that's a very grassroots effort that has come up and obviously gained some notoriety, and that is because of working groups like this and community events like this that help that to happen. So, and that's me. But anyway, we will start. Yeah. We have probably too many animations in here, but we'll. The conversion doesn't always work. But just a little bit about myself, my background. Some of you are familiar with NetSPI as an organization. NetSPI is a company that I helped found in 2001. My background in information security comes from initially in the forensics world and working for a company called Kroll Ontrack. Learned a lot about security events and the aftermath of them. And so when a breach of security had occurred, bringing in the forensic team, doing some analysis, and really trying to dig down to what happened and what is the impact to the organization. And I took that experience and really learned that there was a lot more that could be done to prevent these incidents from occurring. And so became more of an assessment consultant. And really that's been about 12 years doing technical assessments for organizations, also program reviews and things like that. I think at least for the benefit of this organization, it's important to know my experience comes from more on the you might say beating up applications than it does from the actual writing of applications. But I'm going to try very hard to make this presentation kind of tailored to both sides. And I think that's one of the the important missions of OWASP is it's not just about creating secure applications, it's about testing them, it's about finding holes, it's about progressing the overall web environment. And so, some other notes about NetSPI is we're a product independent consulting firm. We offer two kinds of consulting. One is where we do technical assessments, and the other where we do kind of program consulting, helping build your organization's sort of security programs and things like that. And I think, it's really important. There's no hidden agendas here. What we're really talking about, it doesn't have to do with a technology or a particular method or things like that. It's kind of finding out what works well with your organization and how to improve it. And that's kind of one of our beliefs. And I think one of the things that, this is a topic about compliance, and I just wanted everyone to know, there's kind of debates in the information security world about compliance versus security. And I go into many organizations, and it's not really that they're looking to do the bare minimum, but they're oftentimes wondering, well, what do I need to do to be compliant? I want to get there. And I think one of the things that we want to talk about today a little bit is, what do I need to do to be secure? And I think if you look at OWASP as some of the programs, and I'll touch on some of them today a little bit, at least to the extent that I'm familiar with them, but they are security-based programs, and I want to demonstrate how you can take a compliance effort and map it to a security-based standard or some of the tools that come from OWASP. So hopefully that gives you some perspective, and if there's any heckling to be had about application development or things like that, I might have to defer it. But so we're going to cover a few things. For those that are familiar with PCI, we'll just touch on it briefly, but I just want to cover some of the requirements from both the PCI Data Security Standard and the Payment Application Data Security Standard. We'll pull from that some of the common development requirements that are called out in the standard and map those to some of the OWASP resources. And there's a lot of other requirements that we're not going to cover, so I want to touch on them. But to kind of introduce everyone, for those of you that are familiar with PCI. The payment card industry is really a conglomerate of 5 card brands that have got together. They took their own independent security programs, which are listed on here, and put together this council. The council is really responsible for maintaining the standards that two of the standards we're going to talk about today, but there's a third standard as well, which is the PIN entry device. And so, PIN entry device has to do with, as you're doing debit card transactions, protecting that PIN code from being being able to be extracted from those PIN entry devices. But more applicable to this group, I think, is the Payment Application Data Security Standard and the Data Security Standard itself. And the way that those two work is the Data Security Standard is for any organization that processes, transmits, or stores cardholder data. And these are typically merchants or service providers. The Payment Application Data Security Standard applies to those organizations that sell software to those companies, right? And so if you manufacture a piece of software that is a part of either the payment, the authorization process, or maybe some other things like rewards programs and things like that, those types of software reselling it really applies to the Payment Application Security Standard. And so it's kind of how they fit together. And I think one thing to note is the PCI Council is really it's a more of a front end for this overall program. The compliance of these programs are driven through the card brands, and so as a merchant or a service provider signs up to take or process cardholder data, really it's they're abiding by the rules of the cards that they process. And so when you hear about fines, or when you hear about the council wants you to do this or that, it's the card brands working through the council, and the council is kind of the median point between all of these 5 brands. NetSPI as an organization is we're a qualified security assessor, so we can certify organizations, but really our certification answers, depending on which program, either go to the council or to the brands or to a processing bank. And so there's a lot of complex relationships there, and I don't want to cover those all in detail, but I think it's kind of important to think about where your organization stands, kind of the companies you're working for, and as you're developing applications, are you developing them for a merchant, for a service provider, or for something that could be resold on the market, and how that can apply to your situation. So the Data Security Standard, this is the one that kind of the more famous one. There's 12 basic requirements that come from it, but a couple key items to note is in July of this year, there were some minor updates made to the standard. We're now running on version 1.2.1. There's nothing significant about 1.2.1 other than there were some clarifications and a few wording issues that were updated. But it's a really, the bulk of it is there's almost 250 really actionable requirements in this data security standard. Of that, 28 of them really apply to how you run your development within an organization. There's certainly a bunch of functionality requirements about how you can handle cardholder data. What are the rules to do this or that? But there's 28 common requirements that deal with what is the components you need to have in place as within your software or system development life cycle, and with some of the processes you do to manage and maintain your code. And that's kind of what we want to focus on today. Within the Payment Application Data Security Standard, this really tells people, or tells it applies to an organization. If you're creating software for resale, somebody can't buy that product, implement it in their environment, and then it not be able to be compliant. And so really the intent of this standard is that you can go out and safely buy a piece of software, put it in place, follow the instructions, right, the manual, the simple 400-step manual or whatnot, but put it in place, and that you're not going to have any negative impact on your compliance state. You should be confident going forward, accepting cards or processing cards in the way that you do. And so the standards are complementary to each other, but on the payment application security side, it's a much smaller standard. Refers to the data security standard in a number of ways, but there's only 86 requirements here that are somewhat actionable, 86 to really pay attention to. But similarly, there's 29 development-specific requirements, and they are pretty much overlapping, and we'll kind of meld them together and talk about them today. And I want to just kind of pull out some of the larger topics. We're going to talk about systems development life cycle, some of the testing requirements that are called out in the standard, separation of duties, code reviews, change control, and the mentioning of the OWASP Top 10 and where it kind of fits in there. And then I think one of the things that's called out, which is kind of on the fringe of actually being a part of your development group, but it has to do with the web application assessment. And I wanted to put this in here because it's an important part of the OWASP mission. So I'm just going to make sure I get all of these up here. A little shift in the pictures, but that's okay. So the requirements call out that you must have a documented software systems development lifecycle. And I think this is one of the things, we go into organizations and they have ideas of how, they can tell you all day long about how they're developing their software, the things that they've put together. They might pull from a common standard, but it's not necessarily always a document that they've polished and put together for their own use. And I think, this is kind of the foundation of your software development. And as an auditor looking at organizations, when they want to learn about how you develop software, this is really the starting point that they're going to go to. And so it's kind of critical to get some of these items right, and from that you can fork a lot of the other requirements. From a minor perspective, your SDLC needs to be based on industry standards, and there's no specification as to what standard you need to work with, but it needs to be able to point back to it. And I think it's really trying to indicate that you've thought about this, outside of just your own environment. You're thinking about it from lessons learned within other organizations. One of the key components is that there needs to be security throughout the entire life cycle. And I think too often we see the functionality of a software component be part of your SDLC, and it's too little do we think about what are the security requirements, where can I test those security requirements, how can I incorporate some independent review of this product and things like that. And so these items that you see on the left hand of the screen are kind of more some of the security that is called out to be kind of interspersed throughout your life cycle. And then finally, of course, if you're developing something for PCI-DSS, it needs to be developed in accordance with the standard itself. So some of the things that we don't see very often enough, I think, in a SDLC is that it needs to include some secure coding standards. Oftentimes it talks about how we're going to go through the process of designing, developing, implementing an application, but it rarely does it talk about or point to the rules of an organization. Every organization gets different developers from different backgrounds, maybe different organizations. You got things that are subcontracted, things that are maybe bought, or maybe even downloaded from open source. And I think being able to evaluate your code against a standard is going to be pretty important. And I think, kind of getting into one of the other bullets there is training your developers on how to write secure code is the other big component of this. And if you don't have secure coding standards, it becomes very hard to enforce that element. And so kind of mirroring those two things together, I think really help a better SDLC come to life. And there's two projects that I wanted to point out here from OWASP that I think really map well to this requirement, and things that if you haven't taken a look at, you should. But OWASP WebGoat is a training project which can get your training program kickstarted. I know a lot of organizations say, well, where should we send people? What do we need to do? Can we just do a lunch and learn, that type of thing? I think my suggestion, if you're writing web applications, start with WebGoat and move on from there, or put it in there at some point in time. And I think, the other thing is there's how do you, establish a standard based on or industry best practices? Look at the OWASP development guide. I think if you're developing web applications, there's a lot of thought that went into this document, and it's something that will definitely give your SDLC a basis, and something you can start on. So. We're going to come up in some random orders, but from the testing side, I think some of the things that are called out, and everyone does testing within their application development lifecycle, right? But one of the things that you really kind of need to think about is putting some security testing, and there's security testing that will call out more in a specific and kind of standard role, but I'll just keep clipping. But in this case, a lot of these kind of map back to things that you see in the OWASP Top 10, but your testing needs to include, and you need to sort of document how you're going to do this, but your validation of input into an application. You need to document how your testing is going to handle, the error handling of the application. And so this is, as you think about it in your unit testing or maybe your regression testing, making sure that, that your testers kind of have some instruction on how to do this. People always have a good set of requirements that they go off of for functionality, but it's not always do they have a good set of requirements to go off of both input and output. Obviously, you're handling cardholder data. You need to worry about two things: securing it as it's in motion and securing it as it's in, in storage or in transit and in storage. But making sure that your tests are looking within the database or looking within files that are created, making sure that there aren't cardholder data in there. A PCI auditor is going to go through and do the same thing. You need to make sure that you're doing this on a regular basis. And even minor things like monitoring the communication, and making sure that you can't get to this website via HTTP. We see this quite often. You go to a website, it'll accept credit cards, but it'll also accept them over HTTP. Just something that could be easily caught in testing. You're going to have a lot of different roles and responsibilities within a payment application. Really, it's naming who can do what, who can access the cardholder data, or who can just print reports. Validation of those roles needs to be in there as well. And I think this last bullet on here is something you don't see as much in the payment card. I'll make a statement about just in general. Production data should not be used for testing, and I think we see this all the time. And in penetration tests, when we're going into an organization and you're trying to get access to sensitive information, the treasure trove that we always find, hands down, is in the test area. And it just really comes from copying that data and copying it from production, moving it to test. The controls are always looser. There's no auditing in many times. There's maybe no network access control as well. And so if there's something to pull out of the standard to bring back to your organization, this actually may be one of the better ones, is keep your sensitive data where it needs to be. And I think I should call out the OWASP testing project is one of the projects that really talks about how you can do functionality, use case testing for these types of things. There's a lot of good mappings. Obviously, you'll have to create some on your own according to your application specifications. But all right. The third point I want to talk about is separation of duties. One of the things that we see more often than not is that it's easy for developers to make changes in the production environment. You learn about a bug. It's an emergency bug. It's something that you can go around, change 2 lines of code, and have it be fixed. From a PCI perspective, this is something that's considered not acceptable. And I think it takes a lot of maturity for an organization to think about how to separate your developers from the production environment or your testers from the production environment. There's kind of 2 areas that are called out in here. One is really that you need to have some access control separating the two. So it's not just a functional role separation, but something where you've got network access controls, you have system access controls between the two. And as you're defining who can make changes into production, making sure that there's an actual person who's very separate from the development that's allowed to do that. One of the things that PCI calls out is that you have management approval for all changes. And, to accomplish this by having a developer have an sort of written authority to make changes in a live production is going to be very hard to prove. Having a good continuous channel where there's checks and balances as to who can do what is going to put some prevention to this. And I think really the goal of this requirement is just to make sure that your production code is not being unauthorized or not being changed by an unauthorized or malicious user, or even in the sense that there's an inadvertent mistake put in there. You think about all the things that you're trying to do from a testing perspective, an assessment perspective, a code review perspective, and if you kind of allow all those things to be bypassed, you've kind of missed the game. So here I'm kind of pointing you back to the OWASP development guide. It does talk a little bit about separation of the duties, but I think a lot of this is going to come down to the size of your group, the maturity that you have within an organization, and really how much separation can you do, and how much is going to be done through policy, how much is going to be done through just different user processes. So. I would speed it up if I could. But, all right. Now, one of the, I think, newer requirements for PCI is conducting code reviews. And it was somewhat always spelled out, but in version 1.1 of the data security standard, they put some guidance out there about how to really assess your applications. And it started with, you could assess it either by doing a code review or a web application assessment, or you could stick it behind a web application firewall. And that guidance really changed with version 1.2, where it calls out specifically that any application you're writing for use within your cardholder environment, or for the resale, needs to go through a code change. And there's some requirements around it. That it can, and some flexibility too. It can be done either through a manual process. This is something where you can have a peer review the code, or you can also use a product, or an automated process to do so. And there's, getting back to the separation of duties, there's some things on here that we see often overmixed, and it's hard when you get into a smaller environment. But somebody who obviously didn't write the code needs to review it. And I think you might get into situations where you have different modules written by different groups, or maybe even different people, where you need to cross-reference that. I think the other thing is that individual needs to understand how to do secure code review. Oftentimes, the code review output I see has to do with, well, did we write it? Is it quality code? Is it written to our normal specifications? Not as often do we see it as is it going to the point of are we testing against some of the, are we sure that the OWASP top 10, for example, are not vulnerabilities that are contained within the code? And I think that takes a slightly different mindset to come across. It's not just reviewing it for something that looks good, but making sure that your coding standards are implemented from a security perspective throughout that whole code base. And I think one of the other things that we see is that code review happens to code that's already in production in many cases, right? And it takes a really mature and probably beat up security group to say, we're not going to promote code until everything's been fixed. And that's really what the PCI security standard is calling out, is that all of those issues that are considered security risks need to be fixed before that's promoted. There's some great references in how to do code reviews within OWASP Code Review Project. There's also a lot of great tools out there which will help too, and I think some of them more define kind of what your organization's budget and kind of capacity for learning is. But I think this is definitely where you're going to find the most comprehensive set of issues within your application. We look at doing live dynamic testing versus static code testing. They find different things, but certainly a code review is going to be the most thorough. So, all right. So change control. This has to do a little bit more on the payment application data security side. And you think about if you're creating applications for an organization to that you're reselling, obviously you don't want to cause a impact to that organization by promoting code that might have an issue with it, right? And so when we're looking at change control, this is referenced in both standards, but I think the guidance here is more called out from payment application. And I think some of the things are pretty basic. Your changes, your change control needs to document all of the impacts that have occurred. You need to have management sign off. Things need to be tested, and obviously if there's an issue, you need to be able to back it out. But there's a few items that are called out in more detail, and that's that if you have test data that you're using as part of your kind of production rollout, those are things that need to be removed. And if you're creating things with default accounts, that's something that you also have to show evidence that it's being removed. And I think we could always point out some of the vulnerabilities that we've been able to exploit based on system defaults and accounts that have been left in there. And sometimes it's just accounts that have to be there, but there's a password that's blank or 2 characters long, or there may be a password that's the same as the username, for example. These are things that, in the products that you're developing with may be in there. And it's a matter of making sure that you have a process that's changing those things before your build goes out. This last bullet is something that pertains directly to payment application, but it's really a challenge, I think, for some organizations to push out there, is facilitating secure updates. We're pretty good at allowing people to come to the website and download updates and put it on their system, or maybe it's an automatic update type of functionality within the application. Things like signing your code, things like ensuring that there's some authentication to get to that site, maybe some either other checks and balances that you can dream up, but making sure the PCI focus is trying to keep bad code from getting into your application. And if you don't have those checks and balances as you're building it at the client side, this is going to be a requirement that's going to be hard for you to meet, and a very important one for that. So, all right. And I know we should all know this one by heart. But the OWASP Top 10, as it is referred to in both data security standards, if you're developing web applications, you need to have checks and balances to make sure that your application doesn't contain vulnerabilities that are identified. And some of that comes from testing, is how they call it out here, more than anything. And so as part of your testing process, make sure you're testing against the OWASP Top 10. I think the one thing I see far too often as being light is organizations trying to be compliant are just putting these 10 lines essentially into their either into their SDLC or into their test plan. Make sure we're testing for cross-site scripting, injection flaws. If you actually go and dig into these within kind of the OWASP projects website, you're going to see there's a lot more detail behind each one, right? And there's some great examples about how to actually identify, how to code against these things. And I think, my encouragement to you is go beyond the first page, right? Just because the first page is mentioned in the standard, don't stop there. Include some information about how you can actually prevent some of these things from being coded in your environment. How can you test for them? And how can you ensure that your web applications are going to be free? And I think one of the good things about the OWASP Top 10 is it's easy for people to understand, here's 10 major issues I need to worry about. I think the downside of it is there's a lot more too, right? And, it's kind of looking at, if you go back to the OWASP testing procedures, looking at all of the issues is important, right? These are 10 that you need to do for a compliance perspective, but I certainly wouldn't stop there either. And, there's a couple projects which are very relevant to this, obviously Top 10 itself, but the other is, take a look at some of the enterprise security API toolkits, which are kind of designed to allow you to make maybe your coding a little bit easier, so that you're avoiding some of these top 10 issues or avoiding some of these mistakes with using some of the, more of a common language framework and things like that. So if you haven't looked at that, I encourage you to kind of go out there. And then the web application assessment. There's a requirement on the data security side that gives you the flexibility of either assessing your web applications prior to production or putting them behind a web application firewall. And on the payment application security side, it's just you're really only allowed to test them. You can't really put your application out there to be compliant if it hasn't been tested. And so some of the things that are called out in the standard here is it needs to be something that's performed by either an internal resource or a third party, but it's somebody who's knowledgeable about attacking web applications. And there's a guidance paper where some of this language can be found in more detail, but really you need to manipulate some of the inputs into the application as part of your testing. And so this isn't going to be something that's done with a normal network system scanner. It needs to be something that's more sophisticated, right? And certainly there's products out there that can do this. There's people out there that can do this. A combination of the both is going to be the best. A network vulnerability or a web application vulnerability scanner is going to be able to identify certain areas where inputs may be vulnerable. But unless you actually are going to the level of inspecting what that output is, what's occurring when you're doing that, if you change a parameter, you're not maybe going to understand the full extent of your web application vulnerabilities. There's 3 projects out here, and I think this is a good, strong focus for OWASP to consider. But a newer or updated document, the Application Security Verification Standard Project, is something that's gone through a lot of scrutiny. I think it's a very mature program. The OWASP Testing Project, which we've already mentioned, and then there's a tool, the Web Scarab, which is something that is great for doing specifically parameter manipulation. And so I think I would encourage you, to kind of look in these 3 areas as you're planning out how to do your web application assessments and making sure that you're getting a comprehensive review of that. And this is certainly something that would stand up to any audit that you're doing from a PCI perspective. So good. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an understanding of the software development kind of standards and practices that are a part of PCI. I just wanted to touch on, more of what I would consider the functionality requirements and things to consider as you're developing and reviewing your applications. But, there's certainly elements in here, and they're very prescriptive. You can read the standard and you can design your application to it, but it certainly has to do with do not store under any circumstances prohibited data. These are things like full track, your card value codes, and things along those lines. if you have to store cardholder data, make sure you're protecting it. And there's a lot of requirements about encryption, your key rotation, and things like that. I think they're all very well spelled out. You're not going to find guidance in OWASP for exactly that type of thing. You're going to find better guidance within the standard itself. There's monitoring, auditing, logging, making sure that obviously anything that's happening in the application can be tracked back to who did it and where they came from. Your organization is going to be doing a lot of vulnerability assessments, and having a program in place to fix those vulnerabilities is one of the larger requirements. Having proper access control around how you get access to cardholder data, if you are storing it, or have the option to maybe display it, those types of things are certainly spelled out very well. And then two things that don't really touch on the development, but certainly have an impact with where your application is going to reside, is making sure it's in a secured network. And so your communications and management of it need to sort of be able to fit in this model. Multi-tiered applications, for example, are definitely a requirement there. And finally, the policies of the organization need to support PCI compliance and all of the DSS requirements. And so making sure you have those in place. Didn't want to get into detail about this here because it's really specific to the applications you're creating and your business functionality requirements. But of course, I would be in trouble if I didn't talk about them to a certain extent. So. Great, and that's kind of the information I have for you today. I'd be happy to take any questions about some of the SDLC requirements for PCI. And I think the lovely Jay Jacobs will be running around with a microphone to so we can all hear you. So.
The controls and requirements don't specifically state, and I don't believe the vulnerability assessment methodologies that they talk about don't state whether or not they're authenticated tests you're doing to the system versus unauthenticated. Now, obviously, you probably want both, but for a matter of costing, to keep costs down to my clients, what's your opinion on that, and what would pass?
Yeah, I think for your quarterly scans, that's part of the vulnerability management program, but you have these ASV scans that need to happen every quarter. Those are supposed to include the unauthenticated web application checks, right? If your scanner's not doing it, at some point they're going to get uncertified by the council's test labs, but most of them are doing it to a certain degree. I think that's going to cover your requirement for unauthenticated, but your sort of annual web application assessment or after significant changes is something that needs to be done with authenticated parameters, right? And I think it's any application that's in that cardholder environment is what's in scope for that. But if you're not doing the authenticated portion, you're going to miss a huge part of the functionality, right? And I think that's where we see, if you're able to test those pages, if you're able to test it with a few accounts, for example, when you're starting to do parameter manipulation, you're going to be able to cross, if a vulnerability exists, cross out of your account into someone else's, and that's really what they're trying to catch. And so it's making sure that person or the products you're using do authenticated checks is going to be critical for a pass. So. Good. Well, okay. Back to back.
Okay, they referenced the OWASP top 10, and obviously that's dynamic and changes, and they have other sorts. Within the policy of these, is it sufficient in your eyes to use a reference or pointer to OWASP versus in policy should remain more static normally and not have to be updated just because OWASP or SANS or somebody else changes their standard? Is it sufficient to refer to OWASP, or should it be spelled out explicitly in the customer's SDLC, or really more in their coding standards?
Yeah, and I've seen a reference to it, which resulted at least in a short-term failure, but where someone referred to the 2004 standards, right? And I think that's the problem. If you're, it's one thing if you can reference it and you can demonstrate that people are actually familiar with it, right? And they can go out there and look at it and talk to you about it during an interview. Then you might be okay. But I think it's, the issue we see is people put it in there, they go through the audit, and they kind of sit back and rest till next year. And this happened to be a year when the standard or the top 10 had changed from 04 to 07. And so I think it's, it's my recommendation is if you can, extrapolate the high level concepts, right? I mean, you can take the OWASP top 10 and in your policy documentation kind of refer to maybe a more generalized or condensed version and then still have a reference to the, what's current within OWASP. And I think that will create enough of a story, that says here, these are the things we're concerned about. And if you want more detail, this is kind of where we instruct our folks to go. So, yeah.
Are the latest versions of PCI actually using the 2007 standard? Like, I was last I looked, I thought they were all still in the 2004.
1.2 went to 2007. And it does have a reference in there that it is dynamic and it will be updated, and obviously to go to OWASP website for that. So, yeah. And 1.2.1, obviously, as well. So, I mean, maybe one thing, just to show of hands, I think, we've certainly seen the PCI data security standards impact a lot of organizations. Is this something that is, impacting your organization? I mean, I'm just trying to get a feel so kind of people have an idea, what it is. I mean, that's a pretty good showing. I think we're seeing, we're certainly seeing these drive security programs. Maybe one suggestion is something to take away from today's talk, hopefully, is, developing your software development or system development lifecycle aligned with PCI is a good thing. I don't think I would just focus only on your PCI apps, right? And I think that's something to consider. Can you take a standard that's got some of the technical detail like PCI and conceptualize it across your organization? I think that's where you're going to have a much more mature application security group and some of the functionality associated with it. You're already going to have to do it for PCI, so it sounds like it's a large enough issue here at this room to something to try and consider expanding on. So. Last call for questions. Well, I'll be around, happy to network with any of you and continue this discussion and see if there's an appropriate time to follow up later too. So, great, thank you.